afternoon, everyone. As you know, my name is Eve. I am probably the most southern person here because I'm sat in Derby, which to me, as a native of Bristol, is the north. But obviously, where you are, it's the south. So I just thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about myself and about why I would be talking about this particular topic. So professionally, I qualified as a teacher a long time ago in 1997. I am a secondary RE specialist, but currently I spend most of my time teaching primary school children, apart from a bit of A-level tutoring that I do on the side. I was very lucky. I went to Birmingham University and I studied with Michael Grimmett, who was very, very well known in the world of RE for coming up with the attainment targets, learning about religion and learning from religion. He was an excellent teacher, can't fault him at all. After qualifying, I worked in a variety of schools, both state and independent. So I had quite a different experience within those different sorts of systems. Then I had my own children. And when they were fairly small, I wasn't teaching, but I did a distance master's degree at Warwick University through the, I've forgotten what it's called, where Bob Jackson is. And what we're going to talk about today is actually part of my research that I did on that master's degree. After finishing that, I didn't go back into normal teaching, and I do all sorts of weird things now. So the Derby Centre that Karenza is mentioning is the Derby Open Centre, which is probably best described as a multicultural education charity. So we do two things. We run walking tours of places of worship, because there's something quite unique about Derby. You can do it all apart from the synagogue within a walk, which is a wonderful opportunity for local schools. We also go out to schools doing workshops. We help with the teacher CPD and various things. That's one of my jobs. I also work for an Israel-Palestine education charity called Solutions Not Sides, who run workshops with older children. So we're talking 14 plus, where they get to meet an Israeli and a Palestinian speaker, and I'm one of the facilitators. So as you can imagine, it's quite emotive stuff, and it's modeling how to deal with controversial issues in the classroom. All of this is online now, because obviously the Israelis and Palestinians can't come over because of COVID. Sometimes I'm in the school, sometimes I'm online, but I'm the facilitator for that. I also do various freelance little things as well. So I do anti-Semitism training at the University of Derby, and I have fingers in many pies professionally. Personally, I'm a liberal Jew. Now we're going to unpack what that is today to say that I'm a liberal Jew. And I have an interesting family background in that half of it is Church of England. And that interfaith background was what led me to get interested in religion, really. That's why I did theology at university. I then went on and did postgraduate study of Jewish studies, and then obviously later on did my postgraduate work in RE as well. So I've always been fascinated by culture, religion, worldviews, what shapes people's identity, how they express themselves. I'm a member of Nottingham Liberal Synagogue. Again, we'll unpack this term liberal in a bit. And that means I'm a provincial Jew. There are not many of us. So here in the city of Derby, according to the last census, there were 115 Jews out of a population of 270,000. Over half of British Jews live in London. In fact, one in 5 British Jews lives in the London borough of Barnet. So we are not evenly spread at all, which presents its own unique issues when it comes to the teaching of Judaism. And I, as part of being a member of Nottingham Liberal Synagogue, I'm the interfaith representative. So I appear on all sorts of panels, increasingly online now, with Muslim speakers and Sikh speakers sharing religious perspectives and so on. I also get called on the radio occasionally to talk about embarrassing topics like circumcision at 7 o'clock in the morning. But, you know, it's enjoyable stuff. I've got 2 daughters as well. One's in year 13 and one is currently on her year abroad in Paris. She's at university. So I've seen the education system from all sorts of sides as a teacher and as a parent. And those of you that have got kids yourself will know that it's quite a different experience, gives you different sorts of insights. Now, the purpose of the session today is to share with you some of the research that I did for my master's degree, which is about exploring Jewish children's perspectives of their RE lessons. Now, this brings up all sorts of interesting questions. In some ways, it acts as a test of accuracy. Do Jewish kids recognise what they see in the classroom? So whether you are teaching Jewish children or not, this is a little insight into how accurate are we presenting things, particularly given what I've said about Jews not being spread evenly across the country at all. So for most teachers in their classroom, they're not going to have a Jewish kid. If you do, you're very lucky. And you may live in London, but you're very lucky to have a Jewish child in the classroom. So it acts as a way to test how well are we presenting a Jewish worldview and a Jewish tradition in the classroom. And as part of my research, all sorts of things came up that kids were grumpy about. So I thought what I would do is share with you some of that. Now, I did my research in 2012, so I have to put my hand up and say it's a little dated now, but given my own contact with 2 Jewish girls and kids in my community, I can add to that since the actual research. So let's see if I can share my screen. Do let me know if it's not working. I've never done this on Zoom. I've used Teams and all sorts, but not Zoom. Can you see that? Yes, good. Okay, so this was just our general title that we talked about. This was the bit of research that I did. Sharing belief and traditions in RE, the experiences of liberal Jewish children from 2 very different communities. So it was based around 2 synagogues, one in the Midlands. So Jews tend to live in cities, just what we do, always have done. And in major provincial cities, you will find maybe 1 or 2 synagogues. They're not going to be particularly big. And the biggest populations are London, as I've mentioned, and Manchester. Everywhere else, 1 or 2 synagogues if you're lucky. So, for example, Sheffield, 2 synagogues, Nottingham, 2 synagogues. And it was 1 small provincial synagogue in a Midland city. And then as a way of contrast, I chose the largest synagogue in London, liberal synagogue. Now you'll notice on my text that I'm using the word shul, because I think it's quite important for us to be using community specific words. It helps to get a sense of the community. It helps to build the framework that we're talking about. So I am going to start saying shul. When I say the word shul, I mean synagogue. Okay, so every shul has a cheder. A cheder is a Hebrew school. It's not just learning Hebrew. It's a little bit like a church Sunday school in many ways. You're learning Bible stories, you're doing lots of craft activities, playing football at break, eating crisps, all that sort of thing that the kids do in supplementary education. So the cheder in the Midland synagogue was very small, about 30 kids. And the cheder at the London shul was big. So we're talking about 100. And the kids that were part of this cheder were attending a mixture of state and independent schools. Now in London, you get a very different pattern because they've got a lot of Jewish schools. And so kids who attend Jewish schools tend not to go to cheder anymore because they're doing it during the week. There's also a slight issue for kids who attend independent schools because many independent schools teach on Saturday morning. Now, for the Midlands-based synagogue, this wasn't a problem. Their cheder teaching was on Sunday morning, but the London shul, their teaching was on a Saturday morning. So that meant anyone attending an independent school was missing out on cheder. Now, various things happened to try and plug this gap. Some of it successful, some not. But it meant that the kids that I was engaging with were not those kids, the ones that attend the generally quite posh private schools, boarding schools and so on. Now, I used quite a variety of methods. So it had 2 phases. First of all, people filled in a nice little booklet with smiley faces. And then those that were willing, I interviewed. The kids that I was working with were between 10 and 16. So mostly secondary school. There was a reason for that. the 10-year-olds that I interviewed, obviously they're year 6, but it was harder for them to engage with some of the complexities of RE. They were doing it as part of other things quite often. They didn't even realize they were doing RE. They thought it was topic and things like that. Whereas in secondary school, it's on the timetable, RE, or whatever they happen to be calling it now. So the choice of year 6 was deliberate so that I could have a bit more of an in-depth discussion with them. So that's the basic thing that I did. And I had a small sample, because it was only a master's sample of 19 children, which was still enough, to be honest. It's amazing how much they said. And one thing I should say, Jews love to talk. That includes me. That includes the kids I talk to. So I may talk too much. Please interrupt me. I'm very happy to be interrupted. Okay. I have no idea whether I can see the chat box when I'm sharing. But if Karenza or somebody can say, all right, someone's got a question, please do. Okay. Right. So I have to say, sadly, that RE didn't come out very well from this when I talked to the kids. I had all these wonderful things. Oh, they love RE, don't they? Oh, it's great. No, they don't. And the repeated message that came out was that RE was too simple. It was repetitive. It was boring. It was festivals, looking at shuls, at synagogues, and it was basic beliefs and not much else. Nothing meaty. I only had, for example, one child, remember these are secondary school kids, who talked about Israel and Zionism. No one was really doing anything particularly in depth. And the one thing that repeatedly came up was that everything was being presented, not just the Judaism, everything was being presented, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, from a Christian worldview. So most of the time, I don't think it was intentional on the teacher's point of view, but that was perhaps their cultural frame of reference. They were.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that would happen in the real? Because some of our teachers won't be realizing what that looks like.
No, sometimes it's tiny little things, like talking about the Old Testament and New Testament. Now, to a Jewish person, that is because it's not old to me. It's current. So it's a tiny thing. If you're talking dates using AD and BC, those are Christian terms. And for Jewish people, and I'm sure people of other cultural backgrounds as well, it's a little bit like, oh, hang on. If you're talking about Bible stories, having accidentally the Christian or generally accepted in Britain perspective. So the story of Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, to me, is nowhere near what we do with it. Is nothing like what Christians do with it. So we've got no idea of original sin, nothing like that. I was reading a wonderful piece of rabbinics yesterday that was saying that the sin was not eating the fruit of the tree. The sin was that Adam told Eve the wrong thing. So he excluded her. So God says, don't eat of the fruit of the tree. Adam says to Chava, or Eve, don't touch the tree. She touches the tree, nothing happens. She's like, oh, what's the fuss about? So it's easy for her to then eat the fruit of the tree. So some rabbis will point out and say, well, the sin wasn't the eating. The sin was excluding women, not keeping them within the framework of being paternalistic and so on. So that's a very, very different place to take the story. And I will revisit this point about a Christian stroke Western worldview, because sometimes when a teacher's not religious, they still have the sort of cultural milieu of Britain, which is shaped by Christianity and is shaped by certain perspectives. Well, this will keep coming up with some of the themes that we're looking at. So yes, simple examples, things like Old Testament, New Testament. Okay. most of the kids that I talk to are actually generally happy to talk about being Jewish in class. Generally, they were happy. The negative reaction generally revolved around two things. One was silly comments from their peers, which is sort of inevitable, unfortunately, particularly if no one realized they were Jewish, then there would be comments. If they were doing certain topics, the big topic, circumcision, if you're talking about that, the giggles start. I remember when I was at school being asked, was my dog circumcised? And it's just general silliness because of the sensitivity of the topic. The other thing is quite alarming. It could be best described as a power struggle with the teachers, because the child is either put on a pedestal as an expert or is dismissed if they're not saying what's in the teacher's existing subject knowledge. So the expert position is a very difficult position for the average child to be in. They've got a child's perspective of their tradition. It might be quite good, but it might be very limited. It's so much is going to be going on there. One of the children I interviewed was actually the son of our rabbi, but he's nowhere near the knowledge of his mother, because he was 10 at the time. So sometimes teachers are putting them in the expert position, and some of my kids did talk about it's like I'm teaching the teacher. That's quite a burden on a child. Even a 16-year-old, I think that's quite a burden. And then the other thing would happen where the teacher would say something and the kid would say, oh, it's not like that in my shul. And then they would be dismissed because it wasn't what the teacher knew, or it wasn't what was in the textbook. Obviously, this would be perhaps more of an issue with non-specialists, but of course, sometimes, at primary level, you're an expert in everything, aren't you? So you've only got so much that you can keep in your head. So that does mean that sometimes people can feel a little, oh, I pressed the wrong thing, sorry. They can feel a bit unsure about what they're doing, what they're saying. It can get quite territorial about the topic if it's something that the child is saying that they don't know. So those were the big themes that came out of this. So what I've decided to do with today's session is pick out a number of themes that came up repeatedly and talk about how this affects the presentation of the Jewish tradition, and also what we can do about it in the classroom, how we can cope with it. Because particularly anybody, but I think also if you're at primary level, you can't have all of this in your head. It's impossible. You can't know everything about all 6 world religions. It's impossible. And then if your school's dabbling in other things as well, you can't have it all in your head. But there are ways that we can talk about it and present it, which allows for that. So the big thing I want to start with is Jewish identity. This is a tricky topic, but we'll start, as I always love to, my computer will behave, with some pictures. So I'm going to show you some pictures of Jewish people. There'll be 2 slides, and what strikes you? You can either use a chat box or you can talk out loud to me. There's not many of us, that's fine. What strikes you about these pictures? Are there any surprises or anything that, yeah, that's what I expected? What strikes you about it? So here's the first slide, and then we'll go back and I'll tell you who everyone is as well. So here's the first one, and here's the second one. There's usually one on here that everyone goes, oh, I didn't know she was Jewish.
Please tell me it's Marilyn Monroe, because I had no idea that she was Jewish.
Marilyn Monroe, yes. So if it's kids and they see Daniel Radcliffe, they're like, I didn't know Harry Potter was Jewish. We'll get to that as well. So, has anyone chipped in? Yeah, please comment in the chat box or talk out loud to me. Anything anyone wants to say about these pictures? Any surprises?
They show the diversity of the Jewish community. So we saw a black guy on the previous slide. We've got another black guy there. We've got what looked like a Southeast Asian family. So it's the diversity of the Jewish community, as well as Indian Jews as well.
Yeah, yeah. Do you see this in school textbooks?
As the PE advisor and the non-teacher in the room, when it comes to RE, I couldn't really say, but I would suggest that a lot of the resources, or some of the resources that are traditionally available, are more stereotypical and less reflective of modern society.
Yeah, they are. As part of my project, I did an audit of what was then the common GCSE Judaism textbook, and I counted the numbers of pictures of certain types. So virtually all the pictures were male. All of the pictures were white. There wasn't a single Jew of color in the book. Virtually all of the pictures were Orthodox, and not just Orthodox, ultra Orthodox. So if we go back, the guys down there with the black hats. And generally, when I'm talking to kids in schools now, as a faith speaker, that's what they expect. That's what they think my husband looks like. He doesn't. So yeah, this is the diversity of the Jewish community. And having a look at this helps us to understand a bit the nature of Jewish identity as well. So yeah, I'll tell you who everyone is now. So we've got on the top left-hand corner, we've got some Ethiopian heritage Israeli soldiers. So in Ethiopia was probably the oldest diaspora Jewish community other than Babylon, so Iraq, Iran, and Egypt. Those are the big old ones. And the community there was marginalized, was persecuted. During the 1980s, you may remember, if you're old enough, there was quite repeated problems with famine in the area. And the Israeli government airlifted out loads of them. They now live in Israel, not always well integrated, sadly, because Jews can be racist too. And but they are increasingly becoming more integrated into Israeli society. If you love Eurovision, the entry this year from Israel was someone of Ethiopian heritage. There are still a few Ethiopian Jews left in Ethiopia because probably about 70 years ago, quite a lot of them were forcibly converted to Christianity. They weren't airlifted out. And now there's discussion going on because they're saying, hang on, we didn't actually want to be Christians, we're Jews. Next door, we've got the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of the United Synagogues of Great Britain. Now, this is interesting because in the press, they always talk about him as the chief rabbi. He's not my chief rabbi because I'm a liberal Jew. He's only the chief rabbi of the Union of Orthodox Synagogues, the United Synagogue. And that position of chief rabbi was actually set up by the British government to parallel the Archbishop of Canterbury. And we have something called the Board of Deputies. You may have heard them in the press. They often chipping in about anti-Semitism, got very busy with the issues in the Labour Party, etc. They were set up at that period to try and make the Jewish community very British. So the office of the chief rabbi is there to parallel the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he only actually represents one section of the Jewish community, and it's the mainstream Orthodox. So not even the guys in the black hats. Then we've got what's unfortunately for children, the image that they generally know, and that is people during the Holocaust. So these are Dutch Jews. This often comes out of their history lessons. It's not just RS that's causing this, also English as well. So I think sometimes in year 6, people start to talk a little bit about Anne Frank's diary and so on. And for many kids, by the time I get to speak to them as a Jewish person, that's the view of Jews that they have. On the far right-hand side, that is the rapper Nassim Black. He was born into a Christian family in what could be described as a ghetto area of an American city, went to prison and converted to Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. You can see by the black hat. And he now lives in Israel and he makes rap music with a Jewish theme. Going down to the bottom line, this is my sort of Jew, to talk in those terms. These are non-Orthodox Jews. We can tell that because there's a woman leading service and reading from the Torah scroll. The picture in the middle often confuses kids because they see what looks like Arabic. That's Farsi, and these are Iranian Jews. Iran still has a community. Most Arab countries have very few Jews at all because they left or expelled and so on. There is still a bit of a community in Iran, but it is marginalized. So here in the city of Derby, actually, I'm aware of an Iranian refugee who is Jewish, and the reason she's a refugee is because she's Jewish. But you'll see there, in terms of clothes, exactly the same, because they have to follow the rules of wearing hijab and so on. The guys on the left-hand side, generally, that's what everyone expects when we talk about Jews. They are described as ultra-Orthodox. We'll get to the terms a little bit later. And then this one. So Daniel Radcliffe, the actor, his mother is Jewish. So in traditional circles, that makes him Jewish. He describes himself as a Christmas tree Jew, in that he has a Christmas tree and he has a sense of being Jewish. He was on Who Do You Think You Are? You know, the genealogy program, finding out about, I think it was his great granddad who ended up killing himself because the police wouldn't investigate the break into his shop because they assumed because he was Jewish, it was a fraud. But he's what you could call culturally, he doesn't identify, he doesn't go to synagogue, but he has a sense of Jewishness. Then we've got Marilyn Monroe. Many people don't know she converted to Judaism when she married the playwright Arthur Miller. And it's known that it wasn't just doing it for the wedding. She was actively engaged in this. Quite a couple of years ago, they sold her prayer book, which had all sorts of notes down there that show that it was actually a genuine faith commitment. Unfortunately, when she died, she was buried by her family, and so she had a Protestant Christian burial. But she had been, because her marriage with Arthur Miller broke down, she remained part of the Jewish community. So she is perhaps our most famous convert, but no one knows she's a convert. Then we've got what are known as Kaifeng Jews. So in Kaifeng, a city in China, there was a community of Jews which was well over 1,000 years old, very well integrated, very well assimilated. In fact, there was no persecution of Jews in China, so they tended to marry into the population. Some kept a Jewish identity, some didn't. Increasingly now in China today, people are rediscovering that identity and building a new Jewish identity. On the far right hand side, we've got Gal Gadot, who is famous for being Wonder Woman. She is Israeli, but her heritage is European. So her grandparents were Holocaust survivors. This actually makes her common and yet not common in Israeli society. There are many people descended from Holocaust survivors in Israel. However, the majority of the Israeli population, we're talking 60 to 75%, are actually the descendants of Jews who lived in Arabic-speaking countries. So places like Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, those countries. So of course, North Africa actually was affected by the Holocaust. Not everyone's aware of that. So places, there were people from Tunisia, places like that were shipped off, but most of the Arab world was not affected by it. They have their own traumas though after the establishment of the State of Israel. Down to the bottom row, yes, those are Jews from India. Again, one of our oldest communities. Jews are known to have been in the Indian subcontinent well over 1,000 years, probably 1,500 years. If you think when Christianity started to be present in India, Jews were around at the same time. Again, Jews did very well in India. They weren't persecuted because India was so multicultural. There were so many different groups. They fitted within the caste system as a caste of their own. So Jews did very well in India. I've often wondered why more of us didn't move there, but who knows why that was. In the middle, that's Daveed Diggs, the singer. He was in Hamilton. He is, again, a Jew of colour, born Jewish. So whereas Nassim Black became Jewish, Daveed Diggs was born Jewish. I think his mum is Jewish. I could have had the rapper Drake in there. His mum is Jewish as well. So there are increasing numbers of people of colour, of Afro-Caribbean heritage that are Jewish, and they're born Jewish, and they are as Jewish. Any Orthodox rabbi would have them. We'll get to that. And then on the the far corner there, that is Abby Stein. Abby Stein was born the descendant of a Hasidic dynasty, and she was born a boy. And she was picked to become the next Rov of this Hasidic dynasty, but from an early age was convinced she was in the wrong body and had to leave her Hasidic community, and has been slowly transitioning to a female identity. Obviously, that's had all sorts of baggage with it, because she's had to leave the confines and the highly gendered society of ultra-Orthodox Judaism behind. She's still practicing, she's still a rabbi, because she received her ordination as a man. So she has an Orthodox rabbinical certification. And she's one of the increasingly great leaders in America now for presenting a new and inclusive form of Jewish identity. So, as we've seen, so many different ways of being Jewish, so many different colours, so many different ethnic approaches. The reason is 2,000 years ago, Jewish people pretty much were in what we would now call Israel, Palestine. There were also Jews in Egypt, Ethiopia, what's now Iran, Iraq, and Italy. Jews were there, but the population concentration was in what we now call Israel, Palestine. The year 70, the temple was destroyed and Jews were dispersed. For a period of time, they were not allowed to live in Jerusalem. They were not allowed to live in various areas of what we would now call Israel, Palestine, and were dispersed. And at that point, they start intermarrying, they start converting people into the faith. In the early days, in that period, Jews actively converted people. They would go out and evangelize, a bit like early Christians did. With the Roman Empire becoming Christian, though, in the 4th century, it became a capital offense to convert anyone to Judaism. So the rabbi would be executed and the person who converted. Ever since then, we're not overly keen on conversion. We do convert. My dad converted, but it's not something we go out and ask people to do. You would never find Jews evangelizing to non-Jews. You would find Jews evangelizing to other Jews, but not outside of the community. So that's why we've got the diversity. That's why we've got Jews of different colour. I'll make sure I've got my bits of paper all around. So let's explore this a little bit further. What makes you Jewish? This is the thing that is confusing for many teachers who are not experienced with the Jewish community. It's not about belief at all. Jewish identity is conferred by birth. Traditionally, Jews view themselves as a people. The Hebrew term is Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. In the Bible, you would see Bnei Israel, the children of Israel. We are a people, like a big family, big extended family. Some people use the term ethno-religious group. You can use that, but it's not about belief. It's a group of people linked by customs, by practices, by beliefs, but not necessarily by food, by history, by shared experience. So increasingly, Jews are trying to edge the non-Jewish world towards viewing us as a people, as we've always seen ourselves. But it's, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been using this terminology with non-Jews, but increasingly we are trying to say, hang on, we are a people, we're different to other religious groups. Now, traditionally, you're Jewish if your mother is Jewish. And this is quite simply because you always know who the mother is. You can't always tell who the father is in the old days before DNA tests. So women were raped as part of persecution of Jewish communities. The only way to know who the parent, where the Jewish status was coming from, was to say it was the mother. If you look in the Hebrew scriptures, you will see people who have only Jewish fathers who are seen as Jewish, including kings of Israel. So there was a time when Jewish status went through the father as well. And because of that, non-Orthodox Jews like me have gone back to that model. So it's now either parent, whether your mother is Jewish or your father is Jewish, and you've had a Jewish education. So there's also what I call the Jewish Chronicle test. Jewish Chronicle is one of our national newspapers, and they will talk about anybody famous who's got any vague Jewish connection, whether it's grandparent. So a few years ago on Strictly Come Dancing, there was Ben Cohen. I think it was something like his granddad was Jewish. They talk about him. David Beckham, his grandfather's Jewish, doesn't practice Judaism. And in an Orthodox thinking, he is not Jewish because his mother's not Jewish. Jewish Chronicle still talks about him. So this is the idea of a people. It's almost like a national identity where people might have that connection. Another aspect to muddy the waters is in Israel, they have something called the right of return, which gives a Jewish person the right to claim Israeli citizenship. Now, the definition of Jewish that they use is that you have one Jewish grandparent. This is quite deliberate because it mirrors the Nuremberg laws and what the Nazis said. So the idea is that anybody who could be persecuted because of Jewish heritage can get Israeli citizenship. When you get to Israel, it's much harder than that, because in Israel, all marriage is controlled by the Orthodox. So they will only let you get married in a synagogue if your mother's Jewish. So there's a whole like subset of Israeli society, particularly Russian Jews, who a lot of them lost their heritage because of communism, who may have had a Jewish father and got Israeli right of return, can't get married. Bit of a tension in Israeli society. And then, of course, there are people who join the Jewish community. Conversion has always been possible. The big story of this, Christians would know from the book of Ruth. I would call it Sefer Ruth. And this lovely line here, your people shall be my people and your God, my God. Amecha ami Elohayich Elohai. You see that Hebrew uses much fewer words than English. She takes on her mother-in-law's culture, her food, her belief. That makes her Jewish and an ancestor of King David. So conversion's always been possible, but generally you're not getting big numbers of people converting to Judaism. But those numbers are actually increasing for various reasons, mainly people in the Jewish community starting to marry out of the community. Some people will then, like Marilyn Monroe did, convert to make a family environment that's of one faith. Now, you will come across, particularly on the internet, another group who call themselves Messianic Jews. And it can be problematic. They're quite big in America, and quite often you'll go online, try and find a picture, and what you've actually found is a Messianic website, not a Jewish website, which can be very, very confusing for teachers and students. So I had to have a session when I taught GCSE Judaism, helping my non-Jewish kids work out what was Messianic and what was Jewish. Jewish people don't really agree on much. There's a joke that we have two Jews, three opinions. The one thing we do agree on is that Messianic Judaism is not Judaism. It's based on the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. Therefore, in the Jewish mind, that's Christianity. Now, Messianic Jews will say they are Jews who accept Jesus as the Messiah, because they're using that ethnic element there. Again, there are Messianic communities here in Britain. There's one in Leicester, which is fairly near to me. They have a rabbi, and I will talk to schools who say, oh, yes, we had Rabbi Tony in. Like, who's that? And then I would say, okay, he's a Messianic rabbi, just to make that slight qualification. On the edge of any religious community, there's the grey areas. You could have it with Islam and the Ahmadi community. There's always the grey areas. So there you go. You've got one in Newcastle. You can generally...
You might go on to this, but given a lot of our colleagues are primary here and they're going to be dealing with the complexity of all this, how would you like, or how would Jewish children like the teachers to kind of make this simple but complex for little people?
For little people, I would say traditionally you're Jewish if your mum is, and some Jews say you're Jewish if your dad is as well. So if I'm talking to Key Stage 1, that's what I would say. Because the risk is, particularly as Jewish people increasingly marry out now, so over half of Jews in Britain marry non-Jews, you could actually have a child in your class who you don't realise has got a Jewish dad. And then if you then say Jews have Jewish mothers, that child could then feel excluded. So yes, it's really, really horrible, complex stuff, but it can be distilled to simple ideas. The real
The census data for the Northeast shows many more Jews that attend any of the synagogues.
Yes,
it's just a fact.
Yeah. Half of British Jews do not belong to synagogues. Yeah. Often. Rob Smith's popped his hand up.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, me again. I actually have some good Jewish friends, and Gidon is Jewish. His wife is not Jewish. But this whole idea of the birth, not belief, how important is it to stress that aspect? Because the idea of being Jewish as an identity, there seems a very underlying strong tone, or not even underlying strong tone with regards to that. But again, we don't want to confuse our students, but that seems an absolutely critical element about being Jewish.
I would agree, it is a critical element. And it makes it very different to the other Abrahamic faiths, so say Christianity and Islam. The nearest thing I can compare it to is perhaps being a Hindu, and how being a Hindu is quite uniquely wrapped up with India, or being a Sikh, and how Sikh identity is uniquely wrapped up with the Punjab. I would say it is critical because those kids may well meet something that tends to blow many people's minds, an atheist Jew. So my husband will very happily talk about how he doesn't believe in God, and it doesn't matter in the Jewish frame of thinking. It doesn't matter, because what makes you Jewish is your birth. It's almost like a national identity. What makes you French? Being born in France and speaking French and having French culture. So I think this is something RE tends to hide away from, but I think it's actually critical. We need to be explaining this. Being Jewish is a people, that people have beliefs, but not everyone does them.
We can do this though with little people through the family dynamic. So in the same way that they will belong to a family, they may not behave or believe or hold as valuable or the same things that their cousins do or their aunties do. So they can, or their family might be split up in some way or blended in some way. Kids do understand that family identities can be quite complex. So we can explain that Judaism is a family identity and there are differences between and within them.
That's exactly what I do with the younger ones. To compare it to like a big family. There's a joke that my children like. Ashkenazi Jews, we'll get onto who they are all very genetically related, and we're all meant to be 33rd cousins of each other. So my kids go and tell their friends that they're 33rd cousin of Daniel Radcliffe. And, part of, when you meet other Jews, you play Jewish geography and who you're related to. It's a big family. And I talk about the very origins of Judaism with Abraham and Sarah. They're like my great, lots of greats grandparents. And exactly that, you don't always agree with your brother, do you? You don't do the same thing. You might support different football teams, but you're still your family. So I think that is the key to it, is thinking in terms of people and people as one big extended family. But yes, I think it is important for kids, particularly as they get a little bit older into Key Stage 2, to appreciate that they may come across Jewish people who don't follow the beliefs of the Jewish people. The big example of this, if you're aware of the comedian David Baddiel, his Twitter handle, his description is Jew. He is very, very proudly atheist, but very, very proudly Jewish. And I think it can be difficult for people coming from the sort of Western Christian general cultural milieu to get their heads around that, because faith is belief. So yes, I do appreciate what a tricky one this is, but keep it simple. Jews are a big family who view themselves as a people. We crack jokes at home about, oh, is he a member of the tribe? It is tribal. You've got the 12 tribes of Israel. As much as they don't exist anymore, that mindset is there. It's like a big, big family. So what I thought I would help you unpack this a little bit further, because there are different ways of being Jewish. So I think actually Jews don't help in this because when I asked my kids, are you religious? They all said no. Every single one of them. These were kids who go to shul every weekend. Some of them were preparing for their bar and bat mitzvahs or Kabbalat Torah. That's a ceremony that you get within non-Orthodox Judaism. They were attending services regularly, but they wouldn't say they were religious. And this can be confusing if you happen to have a child in your classroom. Oh, I'm Jewish. Oh, are you religious? No. They could be going to synagogue every weekend. And that's because there's something unique going on in terms of vocabulary. All communities have their own special words, even in a family. So in my family, for some reason, the telly remote control is called a zapper, Frank Zapper. And you'll have words in your family that no one else would know, just not know. And behind those words is a whole frame of reference that only your family knows. And the word religious is one of those in the Jewish community. Most Ashkenazi Jews, we dominate Britain. Their ancestors spoke Yiddish. In Yiddish, you describe someone who is observant of the commandment as frum. That gets translated as religious, but it just means someone who does all the stuff. And then you get fry, who are not so observant. And when you say to a Jewish child, are you religious? That's what comes into their head. Not do you go to synagogue every weekend? Not do you pray? It's do you follow all the rules of the commandments? And so you will get even kids that attend Orthodox synagogues who will be, oh, well, no, I'm not that observant. I'm not frum. To the average Jewish person, frum are the people in the black hats. So I think we don't help ourselves on this one. And it can be problematic, particularly when you're dealing with kids who are non-Orthodox, because they will view themselves as not religious when they actually could be. Again, we'll unpack that one in a bit. So the general divisions within the Jewish community, and this is one thing I really wanted to give you a flavour of in this session, is the diversity of the Jewish tradition. There are two types of division, ethnic and what we could call theological or movement based. We'll do ethnic first. So our first group that I'll tell you about are the Sephardi Jews. Their reasonably direct ancestors lived in Spain and Portugal, and in 1492 were thrown out. They then moved all around the world, North Africa, Italy, Greece, Turkey. The biggest Sephardi community was actually in what is now called Thessaloniki in Greece, was called Salonika at the time. Unfortunately, the Nazis got virtually every single one of them. That community spoke Ladino, which is a form of Spanish, had very, very unique traditions. The first Jews in Britain were Sephardi Jews. You might have seen in the news today that they're trying to protect Bevis Marks Synagogue in London. They were going to build a massive tower block next to it. Thankfully, they've said no. It's the oldest synagogue in Europe in continuous use. It was built in 1701 by Sephardi Jews. Most Jews now in Britain are not Sephardi. They are also not this group here. These are Mizrahi Jews. Well, I can't see if that's come up. Mizrahi Jews lived in Arabic-speaking countries and what we could call non-Christian countries, India, China. Mizrach means east. So they are Jews of Yemen, Algeria, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, all of those Jews. They are actually the majority in Israel. So if you're talking to Israelis, there's a very, very strong chance you're talking to a Mizrahi Jew, or at least someone that's got a Mizrahi parent or grandparent. And then here in Europe, we've got Ashkenazi Jews. Now, I'm being a bit cheeky, actually, because these are French Jews, but it's really hard to find a picture of an Ashkenazi Jew that's not the religious guy. Actually, most Jews in France are Sephardi Jews for various historical reasons to do with colonialism in North Africa. Most Jews in France tend to be Sephardi, but Ashkenazi Jews are of European heritage. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. The average Jew in Britain and America owes their heritage, their recent heritage, to Central Europe and Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, places like that. Because we're all speaking English, the English-speaking world is dominated by Ashkenazi Jews. The picture that you get in the English-speaking world is Ashkenazi Jews, but there's actually a whole load other as well, and these are ethnic divisions. So, for example, at the festival of Passover, an Ashkenazi Jew cannot eat rice, but a Sephardi and a Mizrahi Jew can. So there's all sorts of practice levels there as well. It comes up in all sorts of weird things. So the Torah, you might have seen pictures of the Torah in your books or in your lessons. Generally, textbooks do the cloth one, the one with the cloth cover. That's an Ashkenazi scroll. Sephardim and the Mizrahim put them in boxes, wooden boxes or silver boxes. Now, one way you can do this, if you are generating, if you have the time to generate your own resources, is if you can use pictures of Torah scrolls in boxes sometimes. That's really useful for kids to see, just to show them that they don't all look the same. So quite often we talk about some Jews do this, many Jews do that, rather than all. You would also find, you may have one of these in your resources cabinet, possibly, the Havdalah candle, the plaited candle that's used at the end of Sabbath to show that the day is ended. That's actually an Ashkenazi candle there. Pretty much all Jews use them now, but Sephardi Jews used a plain one. So there are all sorts of differences. Now, I do appreciate it's really hard for you because you've got limited time, limited resources. And perhaps the easiest way to get around this is to simply say, not all Jews live their Jewish life in the same way. Just a simple sentence. And to use phrases like, some Jews do this, many Jews do that. Just to give a flavour, because you can't go into this, particularly with little ones, but you can give a flavour that not all Jews are doing the same thing. So those are the ethnic divisions, and they can affect practice. The main thing that affects practice, however, is what we would call movement divisions or theological divisions. Oh, I forgot one. The one time that the Sephardim dominate is in the pronunciation of Hebrew. The Israeli government made a choice. There are two big accents in Hebrew, just like your accent up there is very different to down here, isn't it? There's the Ashkenazi accent and the Sephardi accent. And the Israeli government was faced with a choice. Which one are we going to use? They opted for the Mizrahi Sephardi accent. So the festival of Simchat Torah, that is Sephardi Hebrew. All school textbooks use that now. I haven't seen any that will use Ashkenazi pronunciation. And increasingly, sadly, Ashkenazi pronunciation is dying out. So if you go to a shul now and you hear people reading prayers, it's going to be the over 70s that are using Ashkenazi Hebrew. Even in Orthodox circles, you'll be hearing Israeli Hebrew now. The big exception would be for the ultra-Orthodox. They still use Ashkenazi. So Simchat Torah in Sephardi pronunciation, Simchat Torah or Simchat Torah in Ashkenazi. So for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. Just be aware that the terms you are using in your books are virtually always Sephardi. If Karenza, if you want any help with what the Ashkenazi pronunciations would be, I'm very happy to do that for you.
Might be nice just to put them in as a double entry on some of our stock so that actually people are aware there's a different alternative to try and help mitigate some of this dying of the language.
Yeah,
quite interesting.
I mean, I have a vested interest. I studied Yiddish at university, so I would love to keep those Ashkenazic pronunciations going. But yes, very happy to do that.
Brill, thank you.
Okay, so let's movement, theological division. I don't want to use the word theological because it's not a big thing in Judaism. Jews are more concerned about practice than thinking about questions about God. So I used to compare it with my GCSE students and say, imagine shelves of books. When we were doing Christian beliefs, that those books would be rammed. There would be shelves and shelves and shelves about theology. Judaism would probably be a shelf, and everything else is about practice. So when we did basic beliefs at the beginning of year 10, we spent weeks on Christian beliefs and probably about 2 on Jewish ones, because we just don't talk about it that much. We talk about practice. So that's why I don't like using the word theological differences. Jews tend to talk about movements, and these are movements. So these are the people everybody knows, the Haredi Jews, or ultra-Orthodox. They are not as old as you think. So within this, we would have the Hasidim, and they began in the 18th century as part of the development of pietist religion. It parallels with the beginnings of Methodism here, the growing of the Society of Friends, those sorts of inner spirit type forms of religion. It affected Judaism too. So Hasidism and Haredi Judaism is not as old as you think it is, or as old necessarily as they may say. It dates from the 18th century. Then we've got in the middle what would be called modern Orthodox. This develops, as many movements in Judaism did in Germany, where they were coming out of the ghetto and they were facing a question: how much do we integrate with the society around us? Many new immigrant communities in Britain today are asking the same questions. How much of the surrounding culture do we take on? And whereas the Haredim said nothing, the modern Orthodox wanted to chart a middle path where you keep the as much of Judaism as possible, but you make adjustments. Also in Germany at the same time, you got the development of non-Orthodox Judaism. Now this has all sorts of words. Progressive is like an umbrella term. Conservative is an American term. We do have conservative Jews here, but not so many, only in London. Reform and liberal, 2 different movements. And they were the ones that were more willing to make adaptations with surrounding society. And the reason they could do this is because of a big argument about, is the Torah the word of God? So the Torah is obviously the first 5 books of Moses. It's our basic text. It's not our only text. And quite often schools forget that. There's the Torah, and then there's the oral Torah, which is the Talmud, Midrash, Gemara, all sorts of things. And Jewish tradition says they were both given at once on Mount Sinai. So Moses went up to the top and he got the written Torah, but he also got all the oral stuff as well that he passed on to the rabbis. So when Jews use the word Torah, they're actually involving the Talmud and the discussions of the rabbis well. But for what we're talking about now, I'm going to talk about the written Torah, the scroll. And the big argument was, is it the word of God? Now, Haredi Jews and Orthodox Jews say yes. Moses wrote it all down, memorized it, it was all written down, that's exactly what God said. Progressive Jews, conservative, reform, liberal, say no. Jews were inspired by God, by their interactions with him, her, and then wrote down their responses to it. Now, if you believe it's the word of God, you can't change it. If you believe it's the word of man written in response to God, you can. It doesn't mean you're ditching it, no, not at all, but it means that you've got more availability to play with it. Now, when I say this though, Jews are not and have never been literalist in the way that some Christians are. So if you think about some evangelical Christians, creation happened exactly as it says in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis. Jews have never thought that, ever. There are tiny glimmers of it under American influence amongst ultra-Orthodox Jews, but we have always realized, because we've studied it so carefully, that some bits don't add up. And, you know, how did Moses know what was going on after his death in the book of Deuteronomy? So the rabbis pretty quickly picked up that there's inconsistencies here. And so we've never been literalist. But the basic principle of it comes directly from God versus inspired by. Now, my example text, I always use this as as an example text, is one of the most famous bits of Leviticus. If you're a Christian, for me, that's the book of Vayikra. And it's the prohibition on homosexuality. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. And you'll notice the way I've phrased this, because Jews actually don't do chapter and verse. We don't do 1822. We've divided the whole of the Torah up into chunks, which we call a parashah or a sedra. And each parashah has a name, and it's the first two important words. So parashah Achrei Mot means, I think it's after the death. It's just the first two words of the section. So for a Jewish person, if you wanted to look up the text, you would go to the parashah and it would be there. We do use chapter and verse, but it's not a Jewish invention, it's a Christian one. So that's why I phrased it like that. And that's why I'm also giving the book of Leviticus its Hebrew name of Vayikra. Again, the Hebrew names are just based on the first important word. Now, if you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew, that stands exactly like that. Total abhorrence, you cannot do it. Don't even think about it. If you are a progressive Jew, Reform liberal, that was written by men, probably men, possibly women, but it was written by people and was contingent on the time. It made sense at the time, particularly when you were defining yourself against other groups. And we now know all sorts of other stuff now about how sexuality develops and psychology. And in the modern world, this doesn't stand the test anymore. So because of that, Reform and liberal Jews, when the law changed to allow same-sex weddings, the day that it changed, were holding same-sex weddings in West London Synagogue in London, which is a Reform synagogue. The day they held two. And they had been actively campaigning for decades for same-sex weddings in a religious format. They're also, interestingly, actively campaigning for the legalization of voluntary euthanasia as well. So this is an interesting thing. People often assume because you're religious, you're socially conservative. My kids complained about this. Reform Jews, liberal Jews, are not socially conservative at all. The key is in progressive. So they are egalitarian in terms of men and women having equal rights. They are inclusive. So Rabbi Abby Stein, that we started with, leads services. They are people, her community is inclusive of her, even with her trans identity. It's based around very progressive values. So if you do ever come across a child or an adult who says they are liberal or reform, expect them to be quite, I don't want to say left-wing, progressive in their outlook on the world. I have a number of Muslim colleagues who often assume that because I'm religious, I must be socially conservative. So they ask me to sign petitions against the new SRE curriculum. I have no trouble with it. Because I'm a liberal Jew. Now the Orthodox, they're sitting in the middle, and this text has caused all sorts of problems. One of the Sephardi Orthodox rabbis has said, well, two men could live together and have a loving relationship, but they can't act on it. They're trying to bridge that gap. People on the more Orthodox side were disgusted. People on my side were saying you haven't gone far enough. What it's showing is that religious text is in constant interpretation, constant flux. It's not set in stone at all. And even within the Orthodox community, it's in constant reinterpretation, constant flux. So I do appreciate, particularly the primary level, like, oh, do I need to know this? Yes. The key things to take from this are, just because you're a religious Jew, in the Western sense of the word, doesn't mean you're socially conservative. You can actually be very, very loose or progressive. Your conception of the nature of God could actually have more to do with Hinduism than Christian and Muslim forms. And just this idea that text in Judaism is in constant flux, is always being interpreted. Let me just check my notes. I've got everything. Yeah. Now, I would say this question, we'll get back to it, of the use of the word religious in Judaism. Whilst Jews themselves shy away from it, and might not say they are religious, there is a perception, I think, among some teachers that if you are non-Orthodox, you're not that religious, but your practice could be the same as an Orthodox Jew. So you could keep kosher, you could keep Shabbat, the Sabbath, strictly. That's what makes meaning to you. It's just you believe that the Torah is not the word of God. It's the, you know, the experience of the Jewish people in response to God. So never assume, if you do ever find you're working with a Jewish child and they say they go to a Reform synagogue, I'm trying to think if there's one up your way, I think there might be. Don't assume that they're not religious in the Western sense of the word. You ask them, they'll probably say they're not, but you can lead a very, very observant life as an Orthodox, as a non-Orthodox Jew. And it does make it so confusing for people not within the community. Okay, right, very, very aware of time. So these are things I've already mentioned. What can I do? This is so complex. Keep reminding, not all Jews live their Jewish life in the same way. It's like a big family. Do you like exactly the same thing as your brother? No, you don't. Do you follow the same football team? No, you don't. There's lots and lots of difference. We're one big family. We've got lots of links, but we do things differently. Use phrases like some Jews, many Jews. Sometimes you can use majority, but some, many, perfectly good. And if you've got time, do some learning. I can particularly recommend the American Jewish website, Mind Jewish Learning. They have articles on everything and very good on diversity as well, because the American community is actually dominated by the non-Orthodox. So you'll get much more of that diversity there. There are a few other things. I don't think this is going to come up too much at primary level, is it? So we'll skip over that one. That one's particularly for secondary level. The one thing I would say, if anyone's in year 6 and you're looking at Anne Frank or something like that in English, it is always recommended to separate out the Holocaust, or the Shoah, as I would call it, from talking about the religion. So the Holocaust Educational Trust is adamant that, say you're in a secondary school and you're doing a unit on Judaism, don't have the Holocaust in the middle of it, because it makes Judaism look like a historical thing that's no longer relevant. But as we're primary specialists, that doesn't matter. The big thing my kids wanted you all to know, I've got a few quotes from them, is they wanted people to highlight the similarities, not the differences. So I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of Orientalism. So Edward Said, he was a Palestinian author, and he was talking about the West's perception of the East and how it was all exotic harems and spicy food. And it was all based upon difference, not similarity, and it was exoticized. This happens with my community too. If there's an article in the press about Jews, it's a picture of ultra-Orthodox Jews they've got. Recently in the Daily Mail, they had a story of one of the Hasidic dynasties. The eldest son had a Pidyon Haben ceremony, which is the redemption of the firstborn. It's very technical. Generally, we don't talk about it in school. But the baby's on a silver platter and being passed around. They're all dressed in fancy clothes. And the whole article was, oh, look at this. Isn't this weird? Now, my kids hate that stuff. They hate it with a passion. I sent it to my kids. My daughter in France was like, oh my God, is that a platter? You see, it doesn't help. What they want you to highlight is what's the same, what's similar. So a couple of quotes for you. This is kids talking about their RE lessons. Everybody's weird and everyone's freaky and everyone does this weird stuff and they murder chickens and stuff. What the child is talking about is a quite obscure ceremony called Kapara that happens on Yom Kippur. Again, you'll see this in the press. You'll see ultra-Orthodox Jews swinging chickens around their heads. My kids used to call it swinging chickens. You can actually do it with coins, and most Jews don't even do it anymore. But that's the stuff you see. Another child here. This is probably the start of racism, because people get prejudiced and they think these people are weird and stuff, but they don't understand that we're just normal people. And my kids really wanted all of their friends to meet our rabbi. And they talk about, she's really normal. She's got a Facebook page. She shops in H&M. They wanted everyone to know that Jews are just like everyone else. Now, I think, and maybe, I'll be honest, this is because I was taught by Michael Grimmett, but I think the key to this is learning from religion, is the attainment target 2. It's bridging, if there is a difference, because there are going to be differences, getting them to see what's actually the same about it. So if it is, we'll say Kappa, right? You won't do it at primary school. It's very, very obscure. We don't even really do it at secondary school. But it's about trying to make up for what you've done wrong. You can talk about, well, what do you do when you've upset someone? What do you do to repair relationships? If you're feeling bad, what might you do? And they'll talk about, oh, I'll say sorry, and I might buy them a cake. Or, you know, if it's an issue that they feel bad about, they'll give to charity. That's what Kapara is actually about, because the chicken is given to the poor and the money is given to the poor. So anything, if you can pull it back to how is this like their life, then I think you get over this problem. And what was really obvious with my study is that teachers were struggling with this, trying to get it to be relatable to the kids' lived experience. Now, I'm really aware I've talked far too much. Has anyone got any questions?
This is, I mean, you've had a huge amount of content, and I realise some of it sounds like it's going to be too complex for primary, but this is the professional element of the CPD. So you as teachers get that into your head. So then, you know, once you know the hard bits, you can make it a lot easier, if you see what I mean. So if you've got any questions, this is a really good time to ask them, and Eve won't be upset by anything.
No, absolutely not.
While you're preparing a question, if you've got one, can I ask Eve a difficult question?
Go on then.
All right, Eve. So we've got your presentation here. What would one of my Orthodox colleagues make of what you've said? Do you think they'd say, how can I phrase? I'm just trying to think where I'm asking. You've presented a very liberal, progressive picture of how Judaism works.
Quite deliberately.
It's quite likely an Orthodox Jew might go, that's not real Jewish. That's not real Judaism. I don't know. What do you think? What would you?
Perspective, it might not be.
Yeah.
So they will agree that Jewish identity is conferred by birth, because that's in the Talmud. And they will say that as a liberal Jew, I am not fulfilling all of the requirements of the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And they will say, particularly if they're not particularly inclusive thinking, they will say it's not Judaism. So, for example, in Israel, this is the thing they're always bashing out. The Reform and liberal communities in Israel are not funded by the state. The current Israeli ambassador, Zibi Hatovli, has been on record saying that Reform Jews aren't proper Jews. That's why many Jews in Britain don't like the fact she's the Israeli ambassador. So you will find that. I'm sure some of the Orthodox rabbis in Israel were blaming all sorts of people for COVID. I'm sure Reform Jews got blamed at one point, as well as homosexuals and whatever. If you've got those very, very conservative forms of Judaism, no, they will view Reform and liberal Judaism and conservative Judaism as an aberration. It's not proper Judaism.
I'm not raising that in any way to throw any stones. I'm raising that because I need my teacher colleagues to hear how someone in the family might go, actually, I don't want to be related to you, and you're not really my family anyway. Yeah. Which we get in real families. You know, we get step siblings and all sorts who go, well, you're not my real auntie, so, or my real grandma. Yeah. And we get, and children will understand that too if it gets to a place where it's difficult and they hear conflicting views or they see conflicting things. Kids will get that.
But many people are actually probably not that bothered.
Yeah, most families just get on. And actually, most families don't get, even if they don't get on, when they're attacked, they suddenly will get on.
Yeah.
And that's something else to be brought together as well. You know, just because the chief rabbi doesn't represent all Jews doesn't mean that all Jews won't get, or many Jews won't get behind him if it's an issue that they all think is important and he's got the voice.
We actually saw this recently with COVID. The current chief executive of liberal Judaism is a female rabbi, Rabbi Charlie Baginski, and communities have been pulling together to try and address the needs of communities during lockdown and so on. And she was appearing with ultra-Orthodox rabbis. It was the first time it happened. Every year there's a very big conference called Limud. It's a study week, and it happens over Christmas, because for Jews there's not much to do at Christmas, so we often go away and we have a lovely long conference. It's often in Warwick, and we talk about all sorts of stuff. And one of the things that United Synagogue, the mainstream Orthodox, was quite keen on was for the chief rabbi to be willing to go to it. And the current chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, is willing to go to it. His predecessors weren't. So, as you say, most people just get on. It gets tricky around marriage. So, Orthodox Jews might not be willing to marry someone whose father was Jewish but not their mother. It gets tricky then. Synagogue membership, again, it would depend how that particular synagogue defines. But in terms of being a teacher, I think it's important to have quite a wide spectrum of views of who is Jewish. I did have one student in my research who was told by a teacher that they weren't Jewish. I don't think any teacher should be doing that. It's not a teacher's place to define identity for somebody else. And keep a broad spread. Even here in Derby, my kids generally had a feeling of I'm the only Jew in the school, but then they'd meet someone who had a Jewish granddad and actually felt some connection to the people. So I would advise teachers to keep a wide berth on it, because we're not in the business of identifying people. They identify themselves.
Yeah, and it's bridging that gap, isn't it, between not going down the route of the exotic, but trying to have something that's distinctive that you can actually get the kids to latch onto. But there is what you've said about the diversity of the family background and the ethnic differences and the heritage and how they view scripture. There's an awful lot there for kids to get a grip on, even if they're not particularly, without even going down the exotic route of funny hats and furry things. Deborah, have you got a question? Right, has anybody got a question before Eve goes?
Sorry
for I mean, I've learned a lot. I didn't know about the Sephardi thing, about the language, for example. I didn't know about that. That's really interesting. Anne says no, but it's been really interesting. Thanks, Anne. That's great. Ken's feeding back. Oh, that's lovely. Really useful to understand the use of Jewish identity and the simple way it can be explained to children. Yeah, don't be afraid of being simple with kids, as long as you've got a sense of what's complex behind it. I think that's the most important thing. That's why
teachers going in very much with a sense of teaching you as teachers, complex enough, and then if rough pointers about how to distill it. But this is also what you do as teachers, isn't it? We take big concepts and we distill them into simple speak. I'm very happy if anyone has, tomorrow thinks, oh, I forgot to ask this. If you contact Corinda, she's very happy to forward it to me and I'll answer you. So I'm a slow thinker. I always think about my questions the day after. So if you do have any questions the day after, please do get in contact. I'll be very happy to answer them for you.
Yeah. Rob?
I was just going to say, I mean, again, I think, a bit of reflection time is really important, because I think what you've shared today, for all of us in different contexts, from what our preconceptions were, our misconceptions, but broadening horizons, but also thinking about how do we contextualize what you've said, because again, we have a perspective, and it's making sure that what we deliver to our children is open, broad, realistic, but also we're doing it in such a way by which we don't cause offense necessarily, and we stimulate those thoughts. And for our younger children, that's a lot harder. And also what we share with them and what they take home and what perceptions the home has to offer as well. So I think for me, coming from quite a standard understanding of a lot of this, it's incredibly evolutionary. And I think we're getting different perspectives on how we can begin to deliver much better our understanding of faith. And, again, I think a lot of us maybe thought of factual elements were the critical parts of being able to deliver our really successfully. the reality is it's the context, it's the environment, it's the real life people, we're working with. So a huge thanks to you. And again, a huge thanks to the colleagues who have been on the session. Again, it's a fantastic opportunity for CPD to share, and we'll get this out to more colleagues out there. But I think it's like anything, it's the oak tree just starting to grow. And we've had a lot of information in a lot of contexts over recent months. We need to think about it and then come back in a few months' time and see how it's affected our practice, how it's informed our practice, and maybe we'll have more of a dialogue with you as to how it's changed what we do and how we do it. But a huge thank you for your time, your experience, and not quite sure about the accent, because we haven't got an accent up here. I didn't know what you're talking about there. Like, there's no getting on. We talk proper.
Well,
So,
you know, I'm a complete southerner, and people around here take the mick out of my accent. So,
well, Bristol, that's somewhere in that's in France, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
that's.
Let's watch it, Rob.
One thing
Watch it. Us Cornish people object to this kind of.
Oh yeah, see, Bristol, that's north for the
That's like England. That's England. That's miles away.
Cornwall is an island on the equator. I'm sure it must be.
I'm recording this racism. I want everyone to know that. Right, just as we move on, Eve, we need to let these teachers go and get their tea and everything, but that's absolutely astonishing. I mean, I really enjoyed that. I've learned something again as new. I'm sure colleagues in the room like Jen and Elizabeth and others who've been to several sessions will be sitting there going, whilst I'm getting this information in, I'm gathering a momentum amongst the different faith speakers that we've heard from, where they're all kind of going, this is a bit, but it's a bigger family and it's about the diversity and things. Eve, if it's okay with you, we'll share the PowerPoint presentation with everyone who's been present, as well as the recording, because they might want to use that. And what I might want to do actually is go away and make a poster pack of the different identity of the examples that you've chosen, because quite often they're too old and kids don't have a clue or the background. So that might be quite nice to go around with that. We'll have a look at that maybe, Jen. What do you think? Yeah, that might be an idea.
I would say one thing I really love particularly to say to primary school teachers, but any teacher, you can't know it all. You really can't. I've got too many degrees and been studying this for years, and I'm still learning all the time. And it's about just having that openness and that willing to, you know, plant the seed and reflect and think. That's really the key to it.
Did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say that like something like a poster pack would be really useful, because I think it's trying to find ways to kind of link it to what they know and what they kind of understand. So I think those sorts of photos, and those sort of posters would be really useful, just to give teachers a bit of a background as well, because I think it is quite daunting for teachers, especially if you don't have a specialism in it, that we're expected to kind of, teach all of this. It's just kind of, I think teachers are really scared about saying the wrong thing. I know that's what my staff are really scared about. So just loads of stuff that you have said, Eve, in terms of how we can phrase things in the classroom have been really useful, because I can pass that on and just say to them, you don't have to know lots and lots and lots about each sort of individual aspect. But if as long as you kind of phrase it in this way at primary level, then that kind of gives them the right sort of framework and background to then take it further if they want to, when they get up to secondary school. So yeah, it's been really good. My head is blown.
Jen, can I just share something? Karenza, reel us in if you need to, but when it comes to making mistakes, mistakes and accidents occur, and as long as they're not deliberate and they're not malicious, I obviously advocate yoga, and through my connections with RE, was reprimanded by a family within the context of their faith and the impact yoga had in a negative way against them, because it didn't reflect their Christian values. I didn't do it deliberately. But if you approach with empathy and understanding and sympathy and apologize in that context, We invited a new guest to our Holocaust Memorial group who highlighted at the end of the meeting her dislike for the boy in the striped pajamas because of the inappropriate way it contextualized. Well, and you know, part of me is beaten up about that because that was an access route for me with my year 6 children. And the thing is, we're just learning, we're all learning. So I think we have to say, particularly around faith, non-faith, belief and understanding, we won't always get it right. We're not saying everybody's the same, but we have to attempt to offer difficult conversations so people can go away and think about it. We're not telling anybody to be anything other than to be open-minded and find out some more. It's all about learning. So I understand the context of what you're saying, but honestly, we all make mistakes at every level, every day, and some of us make bigger ones, but you just got to eat that humble pie.
I'm sure Eve will forgive all of us in advance for any screw-ups that we make.
Absolutely. I think, and sometimes there's learning opportunities in there, aren't there? When you do make a mistake, there's a learning opportunity, and how you model how you deal with that mistake is a golden opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, we don't want to be presenting kids with the "I'm perfect, everything's perfect," because they're not. Where on earth is the chance to go, I don't have a clue, I'll go and look it up? Because I'm asking you to go away and look it up. You know, we all know this. Let's just be human.
Yeah.
Right, Eve, you're adorable. I'll see you at the FREC meeting possibly. Thank you so much for all of your time. That is so kind of you. Thank you to all the teachers who've been here, as usual. Amazing colleagues giving all their time, the hard work that they do. Delight to see you all. I will get the film out as soon as I can, which you can share in your schools, and I'll get the PowerPoint to you. Just don't share it beyond that, please, if you can, without our permission, just because sessions are people who actually rock up. That's lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.